All right, so this week we're going to be talking a little bit about ethical decision making. And just to let you know, to start off, this is not coming from Fisher's textbook, your textbook by Fisher. I'm actually going to be providing you with some information from Knapp and Samuel Knapp, Michael Gottlieb, and Mitchell Handelsman. They wrote a book in terms of ethical dilemmas in psychotherapy, and I'm going to be gathering that information as well as others in terms of talking about how we go about the decision making process. So, more or less, we're going to be talking about type of problems that we might see, the pitfalls in our attempts to decide how to handle it ethically, as well as some different potentials that we can utilize. Specific things that we'll be talking about is how we would be able to recognize a dilemma, the roles that we play in terms of the ethics code, and understanding when ethic codes are really not enough. So let's first talk about a little bit on terms of how to recognize a dilemma. You know, as psychologists, you're going to be dealing with so many different type of situations throughout your entire career, and every day can be an ethical. You can see an ethical dilemma, um, but a lot of times there's an attempt that we become desensitized to it somewhat, um, or we don't feel that we are responsible for handling certain situations. So the thing that you have to always understand that there's going to always be some type of competing concerns that you're going to have to be, um, cognizant of, as well as be ready to face them and deal with them. So you want to be able to understand that there are going to be those times when we have obligations um, that is mandated by the ethics code for us to see how we are in terms of the situation itself, as well as how we handle it. All right, so our roles. When we're talking about our roles as a psychologist, as a professional, we always going to have to look at how to maneuver ourselves between these difficult situations. That being whether or not you yourself, as the psychologist, might be presented with a dilemma, like if working with your clients, or that of the role of being a witness to, or being expressed, or being consulted by. So you have to be able to know when you're going to have to act, when you wouldn't act, and most times there's no real time you would not act. You would always bring yourself into play somehow. That is being, like I said, providing consultation, for example. The vignettes you've been working on in lab assignments kind of have given you that consultative type role, and looking at these different situations. And we're going to talk a little bit more. I'm going to probably show you my decision making processes when I'm looking at specific ones. I'm going to give you at least my feeling on two of the lab assignments, um, and show you how I break it down in terms of how do I go about making a decision. But that'll be later. At this point, what you want to understand is that you have to know uh, how to approach a decision which each and every different situation. It's not going to be always a cookie cutter approach. There'll be different situations in which you'll handle things differently. Now, with that being said, we have to also understand sometimes having the ethics codes is simply not going to be enough. Not everything we experience is straight black and white and can be read on a piece of paper or within a book. You're going to be constantly within that gray matter, or as Knapp and Company has stated, I like how they phrased it, the gray zone. like the Twilight Zone. Well, when we talk about ethics, you can fall within the gray zone quite easily. And because everything is not clear cut, black and white, and it's more gray, answers to the questions or to the different dilemmas are not going to always be clear for you to just straight out answer. As I mentioned to you in the very beginning of the semester, when I asked you to answer the lab assignments, I told you there's no right or wrong answer. And I said that because what I wanted you to have an understanding is that in terms of how you approach it, we think differently. Okay, what you see might be something different than what I see. What you reflect upon is going to be different because of your own experiences, that both personally and professionally, how our value systems play into this. Okay, so it's not going to always be visible in terms of how we go about reading the ethical standards, but they are still there. And it's hopefully to help you to be able to have a course of action and understand that it's not going to always be an immediate type of course of action you can come up with, because each situation would be different. So sometimes we don't always know how to approach a particular situation. And in order for us as psychologists to kind of begin to have that better understanding on how to address those different issues that will come up, we need to be able to have a clear way of how we look at the situation. How would we utilize the ethics code? And then ultimately, how do we go about making that decision? All right, so when we often look at the ethics code, we look at it punitively. We know that it's to perform our duties, that we have to be able to look at what people deem as prohibition to basically avoid liability. We all have to take out insurance when we do therapy in case we are liable for something. But we also would see the ethics code as an obligation because this is our chosen career. And when we chose to step into this role, we chose this with the understanding that there's principles and standards that are expected of us. And it's that foundation that should help, hopefully, propel us to be able to see how we will go about handling those. So the intent is for the ethics code is to be a guide. And when I'm talking about the ethics code, thinking about it positively. Let it be a guide as well as an inspiration to help you toward your highest ethical ideals of the profession. Our general principles, in contrast to those ethical standards, are not just representative obligations and things that we should not be able to form in when we're talking about imposing sanctions, but we should be relying on these general principles to either help those reasons that distorts both the meaning and the purpose. Yet, even with that understanding, you have to be able to see it can be used as a fear tactic. And a lot of people think of the ethics code in that premise. They see it as a fear tactic. Oh, I have to do it like this or else. It's that attitude that's got more negative connotations instead of positive ones. Now, Knapp and Company, they talk about positive ethics as an approach that hopefully would help you see an alternative way of thinking. This is involving more of being able to see the ethics code more like a dance partner, one in which it leads you when necessary but allows you to take the lead as well. And I read a great definition in terms of aspirational ethics. And this is actually from a gentleman named Charles Harris, who's in engineering, not psychology, but engineering. But he proposed that an important distinction in engineering ethics is between preventive ethics, which consists of guidelines for preventing harm to the public, and then there's aspirational ethics, which consists of guidelines and motivating considerations for one's professional expertise to promote human well-being. Now, although again his profession was in engineering, I found this holds true to what positive ethics mean and how it can be done in psychology. Besides having a positive outlook on your profession, there's always going to be these advantages to be able to take a different approach. That being adopting a sensitive approach in which there's in some ways would allow us to see ethical issues better. It's going to also help to motivate you to see yourself within a higher standard of conduct, not only just for yourself, but for others. You should and hopefully become more objective in your decision-making process, or you will at least rely more on the ethics code and not just your personal belief systems. Because again, although we may have high moral standards, that doesn't necessarily mean that what we feel is right is actually the correct action to take in a given situation professionally. How we go about accomplishing this feat is not going to be as difficult as one can imagine. Knapp and Company, they talked about how there's 3 different models that can help to utilize the positive approach in ethics and in decision making. All right, so in terms of talking about ethical decision making, first I'd like to introduce and talk about principle-based decision making, and it's based on a system of ethical concepts and principles that can be applied across many different situations. Principle-based decision making relies on a set of time-tested principles like honesty, respect, equality, fairness, as well as courage. It also looks into your intellect, analytical, as well as quasi-legalistic. Okay, but it's a guide for one's choice when dealing with ethical dilemmas. Principle-based decision within the field of psychology, as well as other disciplines like law enforcement, for example, is good because each discipline has a clear set of core ethical standards and principles that are set in place. Additionally, with principle-based decision making, it kind of fits well with the types of repetitive ethical challenges that we might face in a therapeutic and consultative situation. And instead of just attempting to make decisions based off of one's imagined type outcomes as we try to play it out in our minds with nothing to lean against, we really need to only act according to our principles and standards that's within the ethics code. And ultimately, the goal of ethics training for students such as yourself, as well as psychologists like me, would be to help increase our level of competency by emphasizing the importance of what those standards and expectations are in terms of the principle-based decision-making practices. Now, Kahneman and Tversky, they did work that spanned decades that gave a lot of information in regards to the decision theory. And pretty much what they reported was that the choices among risky prospects usually will exhibit several pervasive effects that's going to be inconsistent with basic types of utility theory, especially with people that have underweight outcomes that are going to be merely probable in a comparison with outcomes that will be obtained from something that is certain. And what they said is that the tendency is called a certainty effect. And it contributes to the risk aversion within our choices that involves how there is going to be those sure gains and then the risk taken in other choices that would definitely come up as a loss. So in addition to that, people would generally discard components of the shared prospects under consideration. And that tendency, they called it isolation effect. Pretty much meaning that it leads to an inconsistent preference when brought up with the same type of choice that's presented in a different form. So with an alternative type theory being developed, if we can look at the value that's going to be assigned to what would be gained or what would be lost, rather than just take the final assets and guess at it, then it helps to shift that decision weight. Taking time to look deeper into it helps to kind of make that scale tip in the direction that should be moving. And it's that value function that's normally going to concave toward more of the gains, and kind of help drop the scale for the losses, so that a person who generally would see themselves always picking the wrong side, when they take time to look at things, that decision making process is going to help in terms of moving you toward the right direction, rather than going toward the lower of corresponding type of probabilities. So basically, using the decision theory, it's about not being overall. In Knapp and Company, they also talked about this in terms of, usually when we're stressed out, it's a little more difficult for us to make correct choices. How we see things is because we'll be a little bit more rash and a little bit more rushed, because we want to get rid of that stress or anxious feeling that we're having. So we think that sometimes we have to take an immediate response in order to fix a situation, instead of thinking it through and planning it out to see exactly what it is that we should do. So a lot of times when we're talking about the ethics code, one of the things I've stressed to some of you as y'all submitted some of your work and papers is that I wanted you to, although you gave responses that were just fine, what I wanted you to do was go take a look at the ethics code itself. What jumped out on the page to you when you read a particular vignette? How do you go attacking at it as an approach? Instead of just simply responding saying, I wouldn't do that, why not? Break it down to see what exactly it is that you should be doing in terms of making the decisions that you've made. All right, so now we're going to take a look at some different decision-making type of models. We have what we call System 1 and System 2 type thinking. Of course, this is a dual process theory. I'm going to break it down and first talk about System 1, and then we'll move on to System 2. But with System 1 type thinking, here individual thinks fast. Things are usually rapid, and it's on an automatic response. And it's operating on an assortment of heuristics. And heuristics are going to be usually those efficient type of cognitive processes that's conscious as well as unconscious. That being a large part of it is where we ignore parts of the information. Because using heuristics generally saves time and effort, the classical view has been that a heuristic decision implies greater errors than do rational decisions that's defined more by logic or statistical type models. But for many decisions, the assumptions of rational models aren't always met, and it is an empirical rather than a priori type issue of how well our cognitive heuristics will function in an uncertain world. And so to answer the descriptive question, which would be heuristics, how do people use heuristics in particular situations? And then a prescriptive type question of when should people rely on a given heuristic rather than strategizing through complexities to make judgments. In terms of what we're speaking about in ethical decision making, there's two main type of heuristics I wanted to speak about. The first one being availability heuristic. And this here, it describes our tendency to use information that comes to mind really fast and easily when we're making decisions about the future. So pretty much one thing as an example comes to mind is I thought about Whoopi Goldberg. Now Whoopi Goldberg You could never get the woman to get on a plane. As far as she's concerned, that's a sure way to die. And instead, she'll take a bus anywhere within the United States. That's how she's going. That's how she's traveling. She will ride in a vehicle or in a bus rather than get on a plane. And why I give this as an example is because here she's thought about it quickly. To her, the plane is a death trap. But how many car accidents have we heard about, specifically with buses, and hearing about how people have gotten hurt in that aspect as well? That's one of those type of forms in terms of availability heuristics. It's looking at frequency of situations, but not necessarily the meaning within the given situation. Another type would be what we call representative heuristic. And this is used to determine whether a person or a situation should be put into a category by arbitrating the similarities of the person or the situation to a prototypical type of equivalent. Now, the prototypical person or situation in a particular category would be possessing the highest number of characterizations within that given category. So an example of this would be, say a psychologist worked with mainly females that had been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. With the representative heuristics, that psychologist might not see that a male that's presenting with borderline personality traits would even be considered to have borderline personality disorder if they were relying on representative type heuristics. The other involvement with system one thinking would be biases, and the main bias here is confirmation bias. Now we know that this occurs from a direct influence of one's desires on beliefs. When people would like a certain idea or concept to be true, they end up believing it to be true even if it's not. And they'll be motivated by what we call wishful thinking. So this error tends to lead a person to stop gathering information. A great example of that, I don't know if you, which social media venues you use, but I used to be on Facebook a lot. I'm not as much anymore. I'm not on many of the social media anymore because I got fed up with everybody. But anyway, one of the things that I always would get frustrated about is how people would post information that they got, and they would share it with everybody without going into looking at whether the facts are true or not. One of the more common types I would see is how they would discuss how a child is missing. And yes, it's important to share that kind of information. But did they take a look at how long ago that particular event occurred? Did they check to see if the child was found, or what was the outcome or result? A lot of times I would go in and I would go look at the particular event, and I would look it up on the internet, specifically if they had Amber Alerts and anything. And usually when you can go to the website within that state, they let you know whether or not a person's been found, if they're still missing, or so have you. And I mean, I've had so many of them where thankfully, where kids were missing were found, and it was already reported, and that the event that they're spreading now and saying, oh my God, please help and spread the word and share this word, and it happened 2 years ago. That is what confirmation bias is about. They've seen it, so they believe it. It's happening at this time, without delving into making sure all the information is there and correct. So in that aspect, you have to be able to understand that we have to follow the evidence, and a lot of times that doesn't happen. And what happens is the information they do receive, they take that as being truths. So another thing that resonates within me in terms of confirmation bias is when I was reading uh, Knapp and Company's book, is how they say we have a blind spot in terms of our perceived biases. One of the things that, in terms of a bias, we can see everyone's bias, but we fail to see our own. And I mean, that stuck out huge to me because everybody else, will have where we pass the buck, so we speak, and say, well, that's because that's what they think. But we don't stop to see how we might think in it. Like I mentioned, people with the Facebook, it would irritate me, but I would make sure that I correct the information that they're given. But I've had some individuals say, well, no, they're still missing, even though I gave them a link to show that they're not. We kind of get stuck where we are. Returning back to talking about Kahneman and Tversky's work in terms of prospect theory and avoidance loss, they felt that judgments can be influenced through our tendency to perceive ethical dilemmas as possible gains and losses. And that the prospect theory, again, this is highlighting those potential losses as eliciting a greater response in comparison to the potential gains we can have. And so what I'm going to do is, in the next slide, we're going to look at an example of the prospect theory and avoidance of loss. So on this slide, I'm going to read it out loud to you, and I want you to just think about it. I'm going to pause a moment before I reflect and provide information. So, an impulsive supervisee. When a supervisor asks about the treatment of his student's patient and how it was progressing, the student said that he had terminated her. Because the student and patient had only met a few times, so the supervisor kind of asked, well, why? The student said that the patient had expressed sexual interest in him, and that he terminated the professional relationship unilaterally to be able to avoid any possibility that continued contact will lead to an inappropriate relationship on his part. Now, I want you to read that again to yourself. Think a moment on what concerns you may have and what type of feelings came from you in reading this particular vignette. Okay, I think a minute and a half is good enough time, which, by the way, this is great practice. Just sitting silent is great for when you need to be silent in therapy. But anyway, let's get back to this vignette. Here the student kind of dismissed their client, so to speak, because the client had sexual interest in him. The student was so concerned with avoiding loss when we talk about the prospect theory, and that is concerns of whether or not they'll wind up being a multiple relationship. The student failed to see actually how his interactions could have more or less led to a therapeutic breakthrough for the client. There could have been an exploration in regards to the reasons behind the patient's transference. And it sounds like the student may have had some countertransference going on, but that's my psychodynamic point of view. But regardless, here, this is showing how System 1 thinking works. Rather than thinking things through, the student washed it away really quickly. Said, okay, in order for me to avoid having any issues or any problems whatsoever, I'm just going to get rid of them. I'm going to terminate. And just basically reading this little vignette, my mind runs to, did this person actually terminate appropriately? Did he share his reasons why with the client? Did he bother to refer the client to someone else? These are all those type of ethical concerns that wraps within one's head. What concerns do you have, and which standards or principles do you see the student actually needing a refresher in? As we talk about avoiding harm, that's one that comes up in my head quickly. As well as when we talk about principles about integrity, fidelity, and responsibility. Just a couple of those just is popping up in my head without even taking a glance at the ethics code. So we have to be careful. I think I shared with you, if I haven't, but I probably did, but it's my best case scenario in which I almost made the same exact mistake as this student did in terms of using System 1 type of thinking when I had to work with an individual who classified himself as a skinhead, and he hated black people to the 10th power and called me the N-word several times. And I got up and I walked out, but rather than just walking out and not ever going back, as a student practitioner, I sought out my supervisor and expressed my concerns. And that magic word that he said to me, which I continue to repeat to this day for everyone, we do have to understand and know our limitations. However, we should always ask ourselves first, is this about you or is this about the client? And who does it serve best? Instead of being quick to want to refer, perhaps he got probably thrown off a bit by the advances of his patient. But even with those advancements, give yourself the opportunity, because I guarantee you, if you haven't had it happen already, there will be some form of a situation or a dilemma in which you might find yourself in the pocket of winding up in a type of multiple relationship. It might be sexual. It don't even have to have sex involved in it. It can be on any accord. One question I can throw out at you: if your client is so happy and pleased with the therapy, with the therapeutic relationship between you and them, and they offer you a present, do you accept it? Why or why not? Anyway, we're going to go ahead and move forward. So a few more things in terms of System 1 type of thinking. we have framing effects and reference points as well as effect heuristics. So when someone provides you with the same information, but they do it in different ways, oftentimes this is going to elicit several type of emotional responses. Now, I can recall working with a woman, and she was coming in with symptoms of depression, feeling stagnant, and working with her, we worked for I think maybe 6, 7 months. But in that time, it was week after week, she would come in describing the same issues that she was having with her husband. And even though we discussed it each week and would come up with a plan, overall she would come back with the same type of information. Now I can tell you, I often became really frustrated because it was like we would work from the week before and everything that we work on would vanish. And I have to admit, I finally had got to the point where I did ask her why she came to therapy. Um, when it was apparent that she was stuck. But for me, I allowed my emotions to kind of dictate how I decided on handling the situation rather than trying to look at how to help her to truly work through the situation. That was that quick and automatic type of thing that comes from effect heuristics. Remember, heuristics is going to show us as humans how we would utilize cues, such as that initial presentation of information that's going to be the basis of subsequent decision making. Now, Knapp and Company, they talked about how clinicians are going to be more likely to decide to withhold important information from their clients if they were told that upon receiving such information that 1 out of 100 people might file a lawsuit against you, than if you was to disclose that 99% of the time we can definitely provide confidentiality, uh, but when we tend to try to sugarcoat it as much as possible in fear of later on down the line being sued. But here again, that's an example of avoidance of loss, our concern and worry about it. For me, I got to the point where I didn't feel like I was really doing anything because I kept hearing the same story over and over. And even though I provided new information, used, evidence-based theories to work with the client, she still remained in that same situation. Eventually, we did move on, and it was like I kind of lit a fire under her by asking her, well, why are you still coming here? And that apparently was the new tactic because it was expressing and being ready for whatever, expressing that I saw her being stuck and allowing her to understand that and hear that. Because sometimes a person needs to hear in order to start gaining any kind of true insight of where they are and where they want to go. And for that woman, although we worked and was provided homework assignments and she was doing everything, she couldn't get out of that same rut until after I think we went through 4 weeks, 4 weeks of hers repeating the exact same scenarios over and over again. Uh, and it wasn't where these scenarios were consistently being done in each week, because I would ask her, well, is this what your husband did again? And she was like, well, no, but I'm just saying, rumination is a big one. So uh, with that being said, we have to be careful because with that type of thinking, it could have went the other way. Um, I was lucky in that sense, but it could have went the other way where she could have stormed out, never got the help she needed. Thankfully, like I said, I was lucky. But it's something that we have to consider when we're talking about effect affect heuristics, because those effective responses, they happen so fast, they're automatic. And it's another way of putting this is that we often are going to rely on our feelings to make decisions rather than be objective. And sometimes we have to make sure that we're being objective and not allow the feeling. Like for me, it was frustration that, I looked up upon by sharing my frustrations. But that decision, it was like I was ready to just terminate the therapy at that point, because I was like, well, she keeps going through the same thing and she's not, gaining anything from this, so why bother? We have to be careful not to do that. All right, so I think I beat System 1 thinking. I beat that horse pretty well, and it's drummed into your minds, hopefully. So let's take a look more now at System 2. Now this one here, this is going to be the more analytical and deliberate, as well as rational type of thinking process. Here we're going to stop and we're going to try to piece together everything through logical judgment. We're going to do a mental search and look for additional information, like how I mentioned in Facebook, looking for more than just what's on the surface. You're going to want to go based upon learning from what your experiences were and how to be able to draw that new information out if there's any new information. With System 2 type thinking, you're going to be more thought conscious and methodical in your approach to how you would deal with those ethical situations. And the main thing is, you'll take your time in the thought process. It's not going to be automatic. It's not going to be rushed. It's going to be something that you'll lay out and plan. And of course, in our field, research is our big component, and there's been research to be able to test just how much a person might be a System 1 thinker or a System 2 type thinker. Shane Frederick, he came out with a study that helped to develop his instrument, the cognitive reflection test. And in this instrument, pretty much it's a 3-question test that's been designed to measure how one ability to be able to activate that metacognitive processing that would allow them to switch into the System 2 type of thinking. So in other words, it's more or less was looking at the disposition to resist reporting that first thought of response. And with the 3 items that's on the CRT, they were considered easy in the sense of the type of questions they were. They were easily to be solved, and one can understand them and be able to explain well. But reaching a correct answer often demonstrated the need to suppress any type of erroneous answers that might initially or impulsively come to mind. So in his study, Frederick, he pretty much showed there's been a reduction in intuitive type answers, like questions that proceeded from the first to the third, as well as he kind of showed some gender bias, where he felt that there was a better performance among males in comparison to females. But how much is that, based off of just the data available, or were there any kind of experimental biases or so forth? But the CRT has been used in group. They've used this actually within the law system, in which 25 judges were thought to be intuitive thinkers, and using this, they were able to pick up on intuitive type cues that would help them to reach conclusions that they would later rationalize and debilitate on. So a lot of times what this study was able to show was that out of all those 25 judges, 2/3 of them actually gave a deliberative type responses, and the other ones were kind of quick to answer, which kind of leads us to see how we're so easily swept up into system one thinking, that there is a significant number of people who do it. So, of course, we can't generalize the responses based off of that one study, but it still gives one moment to stop and pause, that this particular test Frederick came up with actually could be useful in looking at how we all might use our thinking patterns, whether it be system one or system two. And it can help us if we were to do a self-study of ourselves, for example, and go through those three questions and see, do we give the immediate response or do we stop and really think about it? Am I impulsive? Sometimes I can definitely say yes, I am, depending on the situation. But for the most part, what we need to strive toward would be more of that system two thinking, among other things, and to be able to look at and understand that we'll have and demonstrate some cognitive biases as well. Okay, so now we're going to start looking at exactly how do we make a decision, particularly when we're talking about ethics and those ethical dilemmas that we might be presented with. Well, NAP, they give a 5-step decision-making process that uh, hopefully we can utilize and follow. So let me go over them with you. The first step is identifying or scrutinizing the problem. In this particular step, we want to kind of identify what the ethical dilemma or conflict might be, as well as looking at what's the relevant overarching type of ethical principles and how it might be a conflict. In doing so, we have to understand that the most relevant overarching type of ethical principles uh, are going to be in instances where we're looking at the patient's well-being, and if you remember correctly, that's beneficence, and then non-maleficence is when we're trying to avoid harm to a patient or a client. We would also want to try to make sure we respect the patient's autonomy, and usually that's including following wishes of the patient in goal setting and helping them to, be a part of the treatment plan process. So you want to be able to stop, look, and listen is what I like to say. Stop and look at the situation head on. And then you want to break it down. When they're saying scrutinize, stop and see exactly what is each facet to the particular situation, so that you have a clear understanding of what's going on before you. Their second step is speaking about developing alternatives or being able to hypothesize various solutions. Now, in this step, here Knapp and Company, they're speaking about how psychologists can best reach a decision after they've been able to find useful alternatives. Not just something to throw out in the air, but something that's actually going to be a possibility of utilizing. More or less, they go on and talk about how we can improve the number of as well as the quality of our options if we stop and listen and talk to our clients, in terms of helping to be able to influence their decisions. But the same can hold true for ourselves. When we are presented with a situation that might have conflicts involved, we want to be able to take heed and listen through consultation. Like I told you in the beginning, you will hear me use this word over and over again. But when you talk it out, it's just like with therapy. Our hope is that we're a guide for our clients and patients, for them to reach insight in what's going on with them. Well, you can think of the same thing holding true through a consultation with your colleague, as helping you to gain insight on how to go about resolving a particular situation or issue. Now, in saying that, we have to also be ready to discuss these issues, not only with our clients, but having these conversations with other affected people. And that can be, like I said, through the formal consultations. So, in terms of if you're having a difficult time working with a client, if you are afraid that there's a multiple relationship issue that's present, or anything of that matter, or if you think that you have a duty to warn, it's okay to consult. It's really important that you do so. Knapp and them continue to talk about how there's been evidence that would support the importance of listening to talking, particularly when we're looking at social media and networks, that would help to generate good ideas. You can see so many different facets of psychology now when we speak about social networks and on being on the internet. You have all type of self-help groups that's been developed. You have a lot of information that's being posted and put out there that assists our clients. You can find anything you want in terms of looking at ethics. Go to the APA site and they give you a plethora of information that hopefully can help you answer the question to a specific problem you're having. So it's a benefit in terms of soliciting input to help you in making your decision on a particular situation. Also, within the realms of developing alternatives as well as hypothesizing for solutions is your ability to reflect. You want to be able to take time to look at those distortions, cognitive distortions, and the emotions that might derive from them, and to ensure that you're being objective in your process of thinking. Oftentimes we have to deal with emotional interference, and that can, stop a lot of psychologists from recognizing their cognitive processes, and find themselves with that availability heuristic that we talked about earlier. That will influence how you decide on a particular situation. So it's important for us to be able to kind of put a halt to that system one type thinking and work toward moving to the system two type of thinking. Now, in terms of step 3, we're talking about analyze and evaluate. Here, this is when we want to analyze, evaluate, and be able to select those optimum type of interventions that can be put into place. The best solutions Knapp talks about it being often coming from when psychologists can identify both advantages as well as disadvantages, and it'll include things that's going to be practical, clinical, as well as legal considerations. And that within that, from moving from step 2 to step 3, that would be the perfect progression. But you have to also see it as it's a perspective based off of that principle-based ethics that we would help to use to resolve these different situations in hopes that we would utilize our ethical principles, and not let it be where our personal principles will override it. So when we're doing the step 3, we want to look at a few things. The first one would be that the decision maker has to have a sufficient reason to be able to act upon, or behalf of one overarching ethical principle rather than another. The second one would be that the action has a realistic chance of being successful, that what we're going to do will actually help to resolve that particular dilemma. The third one's going to be that the decision maker can find no morally preferable alternative, that you thought things through, you tried to come up with as many different options as you can, and you came up with the best suitable option. And then the fourth thing you want to consider and look at would be how the decision maker needs to seek out and minimize the negative effects of infringing on the offended type of ethical principle involved. So, I mean, those are just a few ways that you would try to analyze and evaluate. The fourth step is talking about act or perform. And in this fourth step, this is going to be one of your more complex areas because even when you deliberated intently, now it's where you have to stop and put things into action. And that's not always easily done. Okay? So when we experience ambivalence, for example, uh, we need to be able to take step 4 and be able to reflect on the reasons why we may feel ambivalent toward the situation, how we might be able to change that and turn it around and become more active agents in the decision-making process. A good decision would be implemented badly is something that we have to be careful of. That meaning, we come up with the right idea, but how we implement it. Take, for example, when we looked at the case in which the psychologist was told by one client that another client was sleeping with another therapist. In our responses, we kind of was timid in our approach. There was some that was timid in the approach of wanting to approach that clinician and say, look, this is what I've heard, and this is something that I needed to approach you with. So although we know that something needed to be done, sometimes fear can play a factor in keeping us from actually acting out what should be done. Okay? So we have to be careful on that. The fifth step is looking back or evaluate. Now here you're looking at the solution. That's what you're looking back at. Did I come up with the best plan possible? Did I take time and look at all the different alternatives that would be necessary? When we're looking at this 5-step model, if we followed it, hopefully the result would be that the solution we finally did come up with is going to resolve that particular dilemma. And then that's something that you now can put in your long-term memory and keep for another situation in the future. You'll want to evaluate, did it actually work? Is it something that I can use toward another situation or reflect back on how to approach the next situation? So that would be your 5th step. Realize with this 5-step model, it's more of a dynamic type of model, and it's not necessarily fixed or linear, and you can resolve one dilemma by looking back, like I said, at other situations that you've utilized this approach, and it'll help you by giving you more information to be able to alter your previous interpretations to particular issues and problems by making you open up more and think more about how to go about solving those. So those are the 5 steps. And now there's a whole lot more. I mean, this is a whole textbook that I'm looking at. But I wanted to point out just a couple of those things, and these was something that was more prominent that I think would help in terms of how you go about identifying the issues, how you'll develop your solutions, and doing that through analysis, what ways you would go by actually performing and setting out to do the plan that you come up with, and then reflection. That's another way you could put this 5-step theory. So with that being said, what I'm going to share with you next will be my take on the lab assignments of number 4 and number 5. I mean, I can go through all 5 of them, and if anybody have questions on the first 3, feel free to send them to me, and I'll be happy to send you my reflections on those as well. But I did want to, since we have not had, unfortunately, this has been a time in which we have not had the face-to-face that I was hoping for, and that's okay. I'm hoping that by giving you this information, you still get not just a lecture, but actual things that you might want to consider in doing when you're thinking in terms of ethics. So on that note, I will show you my reflections in the next slide. All right, so with lab assignment number 4, we were looking at Dr. Jordan and the question of whether or not Dr. Jordan should become a co-author with a former patient. Some of you I've already sent my reflections to, a couple of you, and actually it's what made me decide to include it all together within the lecture today, so that everybody can get a chance to hear it and get my perspective on it. So the first and foremost is how you would stop, and you can utilize the 5 steps in thinking and kind of breaking it down. You need to identify what those ethical concerns would be, and from that point, because as if you can remember with Dr. Jordan, the client was a former client, hadn't been with that client for over a year, uh, and when started speaking with her, the client was like, well, you know, through therapy, with the other therapists, I was taught to do some journaling and writing, and this got me an idea that I need to, really try to help others by helping myself, uh, by sharing this information. And Dr. Jordan, I think it would be a great idea if you could, consult with me and be a co-author in my book. Now, the client themselves, she has every right to share whatever she would like. It's up to her to be able to do that. And the question would be, should Dr. Jordan even be involved? My thought would be no, that Dr. Jordan should really decline, politely, of course, because you don't want to alienate or harm through any type of strenuous mental issues with that client. But some of the reasons I felt came a lot from Section 3 of the Ethics Code. And when you look at these standards, one of the things I want y'all to get in habit to, I know a lot of you have been responding to vignettes in which you give and share the thoughts around it. What I want to push you more towards, and this is going to help you in terms of when we're talking about those 5 steps, when you are identifying the issue itself and you're looking at these concerns, you need to start formulating in your mind which standards or principles should you be even looking at when you're going to work on trying to make a decision. For myself, I looked at the following different standards that's found in Section 3, which is human relations. And these are including avoiding harm. Okay, now we know that Dr. Jordan's involvement can actually be really hard for the patient's mental wellness, even though they're now no longer uh, meeting therapeutically. This is going to change their relationship status, and there's going to be times, understand there will be times like when we are forced to make a person and try to get them to pay their bill. We can make a person uncomfortable in that sense. Sometimes we have to make a person uncomfortable for them to be able to see the situation that they're dealing with in front of them. There are going to be times that the issue of harm can come into play that is inadvertently done, but you want to avoid, and you need to know the difference between that inadvertent to malicious intent or being intentional. Uh, in this case, I side on the fact that I don't feel that Dr. Jordan would be necessarily having to do this uh, type of situation, that Dr. Jordan would be more in control and should be able to say that, yeah, I'm going to have to decline. I thank you so much for thinking about me, and I'm so happy that you're moving yourself toward this in terms of growth for yourself. However, my responsibility as far as being a former therapist to you is to allow you to be able to do this book on your own. If there's questions that I can answer, that's no problem. But to be an overall co-author, really wouldn't be actually conducive to your continued mental health, basically. And that's something that's how it could be said. The second one is 3.05, and this is multiple relationships. And although he's no longer seeing this client, it's only been 1 year. Okay. And the ethics code is kind of clear when it talks about the fact that any type of relationship outside of the therapeutic relationship should not be happening unless there has been a minimum of 2 years. And I say that with emphasis because 2 years really doesn't necessarily mean that's enough time has passed in which a psychologist can still be detrimental in terms of exploitation as well as manipulation of or being harmful to the client, because the relationship, the client is not going to see the professional side anymore. The client is going to see more of a personal relationship because they're working on something that's personal to her, not necessarily that's going to benefit him, but it benefits her. But she might see this as, oh, we're connected and we're now friends, which that's what you have to be careful of. So, and that moves to the 3.08, looking at exploitative relationships. Now, being a co-author, that can be exploitation in some ways, benefiting the Dr. Jordan more so than benefiting her. And that's not only just monetarily purpose-wise, but it can be a mental exploitation. So when you're dealing with clients, you have to be careful that the things that you do is going to be in the client's best interest and not necessarily your own. So I have several others, but I just wanted to start pointing out those 5 steps to you, in that when I approach the question, the vignette, I wanted to look at what is the issue. The issue was, should Dr. Jordan join up with the client? Come up with alternatives. It's like one of the questions asked is, what advice would I give? And my advice to them would be that I think they would avoid doing the book with their former client. And I would remind them on the reasons why, expressing these specific standards, and how it can relate to Dr. Jordan in a way that's not positive. And also demonstrate, what positive outcomes can be from the client being able to progress on their own and not feel like they have to rely on a therapist to help them make it to the next step. So that's how I start to approach. And then I take back and look, okay, is that something that, would really work in terms of being able to give a consultation, um, showing the different type of standards that can be impacted. And these are just 3. I'm quite sure there's a few more that I haven't even put on this slide, but that's the process when we're talking about those 5 steps of decision making. Try to reach every alternative when you're doing a hypothesis in regards to the situation. And when you're going to provide, you plan out. My plan was, I'm going to address this with Dr. Jordan. I'm going to express to Dr. Jordan my thoughts in terms of why or why not. More than likely, I've probably not only reflected this, but I might have consulted with someone else too that might have had this type of experiences before, and utilize everything I can. Make sure I'm listening to what Dr. Jordan says, how Dr. Jordan feels about the situation, and not just automatically shoot him down either, but to be a devil's advocate, so to speak, and present positives and negatives. And you definitely can do that by demonstrating with the standards itself. So that's how I would approach number 4, and we'll take a look at number 5. All right. So before I get started, I have to apologize. I know it sounds like I'm right next to an airplane or something because I'm right next to an air conditioner that decided to go on because it is extremely hot. So I have to apologize in advance for that. Hopefully, it is not muffling my voice too much, and that's why I'm speaking up just a little bit, even though I'm using my AirPods as a microphone. But getting back to the matter at hand, I just wanted to talk a little bit about my process in my reflections in terms of the lab assignment number 5. And if you haven't done it yet, because I know there are several of you who have not done these assignments yet, um, use this as a guideline in your thought processes. But when you do it, uh, I want you to provide me, even if you give me the exact same standards, I want your reasons why, not mine. Okay? These are my thoughts and reflections. And even if you agree with me, I need for you to pull out somewhere why you think it was a necessary standard or principles to be utilizing. Okay? So, just as a recap, this is about Dr. Sue Thomas, who has a practice in which her practice has another psychologist working along with her, who is doing the emergency assistance program, in which they provide solution focused therapy. Short, only 3 sessions, but they provide that brief form of therapy for individuals. uh, Dr. Thomas, generally, she doesn't do those type of sessions with others. So because the person wasn't there, she decided to go ahead and do it, and she took the call. At the time she took the call, she spoke with a person named Chuck. And when she first introduced herself, she has the belief that, rather than making people feel uncomfortable, she wants to bring enough comfort to the individual. So rather than announce herself as Dr. Thomas or Dr. Sue Thomas, she just says her first name as being Sue. Anyway, young man Chuck calls. Chuck has, excuse me one moment. Chuck has problems where he's angry, he's frustrated. I'm not going to remember and get into every detail, but finances is an issue. He's upset and angry with his parents. And Dr. Thomas recognizes who this person is. He's a son of a family friend that she has had long connections with. She even attended Chuck's graduation. Needless to say, during the conversation, not only did he discuss being frustrated about things, but he also had presented with homicidal tendencies, and it was particularly toward his parents. Uh, and so she's going to have him come in, and more or less, Chuck is like, well, I don't want to talk to anybody else but Sue. And that's that. Now, we don't know, based upon this vignette, whether Chuck realized who Sue was, or perhaps he did. But we have to now wonder, what are some of the ethical concerns that we have to look at and decipher in this particular vignette that's named Titles, Roles, and Boundaries. So, how the questions that we come to this is looking at what would be those ethical concerns in this scenario. How would you advise Dr. Thomas about how to handle the situation? And if you were the co-owner of that particular practice, how would you feel about how she dealt with the situations? So now let me talk about the ethical concerns. First and foremost, looking at the titles and roles, this is really important. I can recall back early in my career, this is still while I was working at Mississippi State Hospital, I really didn't want to use my title of Dr. Kearns. Now it's Dr. Kearns-Cooper, but then it was Dr. Kearns, and I really didn't like using that. I felt that it it kind of prohibited me from developing good therapeutic relationships to establish rapport. So, of course, now with time and maturity professionally, I do understand and see why it's important to utilize my title when I am introducing myself and working with others. When we present ourselves as psychologists, we need to understand and should do so to be able to demonstrate the following principles. That being B, the fidelity and responsibility. And here we know that psychologists must establish relationships of trust with those with whom they work. Oh, this is quoted exactly from the ethics code, by the way. They're aware of their professional and scientific responsibilities to society and to the specific communities in which they work. Psychologists uphold professional standards of conduct, clarify their professional roles and obligations. I'm going to repeat that part right there. Clarify their professional roles and obligations, accept appropriate responsibility for their behavior, and seek to manage conflicts of interest that could lead to exploitation or harm. Psychologists consult with, refer to, or cooperate with other professionals and institutions to the extent needed to serve the best interests of those with whom they work. They are concerned about the ethical compliance of their colleagues, scientific and professional conduct. Psychologists strive to contribute a portion of their professional time for little or no compensation or professional advantage. So now, when we go back to the vignette, when Dr. Thomas addressed herself as merely Sue, Chuck did not immediately recognize her as a family friend, as far as I see it in this vignette. And this can be seen as manipulative and can also lead to harm for Chuck. Now, the next principle I thought about was integrity. Psychologists seek to promote accuracy, honesty, and truthfulness in the science, teaching, and practice of psychology. In these activities, psychologists do not steal, cheat, or engage in fraud, subterfuge, or intentional misrepresentation of the fact. And for me, Dr. Thomas might have been misrepresentation of the fact simply because she wound up recognizing who this person was and didn't stop to clarify exactly who she is. To continue with this principle, it goes on to say psychologists strive to keep their promises and to avoid unwise or unclear commitments. In situations in which deception may be ethically justifiable to maximize benefits and minimize harm, psychologists have a serious obligation to consider the need for, the possible consequences of, and their responsibility to correct any resulting mistrust or other harmful effects that arise from the use of such techniques. Now, with that being said, by her not clarifying who she was in the beginning, it's now have a snowball effect. Chuck has revealed to her that he has homicidal tendencies, which now means, did she even speak about the fact that, she has a duty to warn, that there are times when confidentiality might have to be broken? We don't know, but speculating based upon the conversation, I have a strong feeling that it didn't happen that way. This is somebody who was immediately wanting to go in and speak with Sue. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the specific standards. I looked at boundaries of competence, 2.01. So although Dr. Thomas, she's providing therapeutic services, the question that comes to my mind is she really truly equipped to handle emergency assistance program services? Do she have solution-focused training? These are just some of those concerns or considerations that we need to be considering, and it should be made when assessing whether or not to see of clients, when we're seeing our clients or not. Did Dr. Thomas have the training in this area? If she did, then that's okay for her to do so. However, if she is not properly trained in it, or say she did get training about 20 years ago, but she hasn't had any recent training, guess what? then the old training no longer exists, because of course we know that psychology is always evolving and changing and we have to keep up with the times. But then if that's the case, she should merely screen of these calls and then would be able to refer after assessing that there's no particular emergency. Now with Chuck, we see that there's an emergency, but we figure that out at the end. If she's already have a plan of action of knowing that I cannot work with people because I am not adequately trained in this area, my level of competence is weak here, then this call might have went to somewhere else. She might have been able to locate someone else for them, and be able to handle that differently. Section 3, 3.04, again, avoiding harm. By not informing Chuck of exactly who she was at the start of that call and during the call, this is a potential harm for Chuck, and for evident reasons. Okay, here he's letting all his anger, frustrations, and every type of thought process going on to a person that actually knows him. She didn't stop him. She allowed him to do it. It went on and on. Next standard would be 3.05. This is talking about multiple relationships again, and you're going to find that a lot of times we have to deal with multiple relationships and different ethical dilemmas. But in this case, many psychologists feel that sexual relationships is that only taboo relationship that we have to consider. But here we can see that this is a detriment that can occur because Dr. Thomas known Chuck for a long period of time. And that's what we have to be careful of. I have a strict rule when it comes to family and friends. I tell them I am not a psychologist by no means around them. I refuse to do therapy to family or friends. And I'm real rigid when it comes to it. I think the only one time I broke away from that pact is when there was a family friend who was suicidal. And another friend sent them to me and I wanted to wring her neck. But I still worked with them enough to be able to refer them to emergency services. And that's as far as that work went. So we have to be careful about that. The next standard that I looked at was 3.06, conflict of interest. Now again, Dr. Thomas is a family friend. So the rule of thumb is to be able to realize that she could be harmful to Chuck, and it's because she's close to him. She knows him more than she would know a person that is a complete stranger to her coming in for therapy. I also looked at section 4, and that's 4.05, disclosures. In the vignette, Chuck revealed homicidal tendencies, and that again was toward his parents. And based on this standard below, on this information I'm about to provide, Dr. Thomas really finds herself falling within that category, particularly with Part B, sections 1 through 3 of this one. But in most parts, psychologists may disclose confidential information with the appropriate consent of the organizational client or the individual client, patient, or another type of legally authorized person on the behalf of a client or patient, unless it's prohibited by law. Psychologists disclose confidential information without the consent of the individual only as mandated by law or where permitted by law for a valid purpose, such as 1, provide needed professional services, 2, obtain appropriate professional consultations, 3, protect the client or patient, the psychologist or others that might be in harm's way, 4, obtain payment from services from a client or patient, in which instance disclosure is limited to the minimum that is necessary to achieve that purpose. So those are the different standards and principles that I looked at for this vignette. In terms of how I would advise Dr. Thomas, I would address the immediate concern of the potential homicidal behavior. Express to her that she needs to go ahead and let him come in, but allowing him to understand it was her. He needs to know who she is on the line, and that she should also, in the meantime, have him understand the importance of the disclosures, and express about confidentiality and reasons why it would be broken. She should then also make sure to not only report this uh, situation to the appropriate agency like law enforcement, but to also inform Chuck's parents. It's really important to do that. I'm going to try to remember. I have found an article in which uh, we're talking about duty to warn in California. This was several years ago, but it's really impactful and has made big changes in how we want to look at duty to warn. And I'll try to remind myself to put that in a resource area on campus. But I would also just want to come back in terms of advisement to kind of help her refresh her memory on the ethics code itself, as there's clearly some gray matter that, that gray zone, she's really in it. Um, and because she's delved into this, she's got boundary issues going on. She's kind of crossing the line because this is a family friend, and she's working with him as if he's her client. So I would want to advise her to be able to make sure that she kind of gets an understanding of how this can look, how this can be for Chuck, how this is going to be for her in the long run if things don't work out. That's pretty much how I approach these two assignments. And this is what I'm hoping that you'll be able to do from here on out. I mean, you still got 3 left, 3 different assignments left for this semester. And I'm going to make sure I open those up so that you can, if you want to get them done early, that's no problem with me, but they will be due on a weekly basis from here on out. But that's this week's lecture in a nutshell. And I kind of really, looking at the time, this one took longer than I thought it would. If you have questions, concerns, feel free to send me a note in the inbox. If you would like to have a one-on-one conference chat, I'll be happy to do that. I'm thinking that y'all folks are pretty busy, and I'm only going to be reiterating things that I'm doing in a lecture now. So rather than hold y'all to any type of face-to-face with Google Meets, if you want to have a one-on-one meeting, I'm available to do that, but I'm not going to make everybody come in for a Google Meet for an hour. I think an hour and a half of this, as well as reading the articles that I'm putting up, as well as having you do lab assignments and whatever else that I give you in that time span, makes up for what your class time is going to be. So if you like to meet with me because you got questions or concerns or need something to hash out or work through and consult, there's that word again, feel free to send me that, and I'll set up a time where we can just chat one-on-one. With that note, y'all have a great week and be safe.